Hello everyone, welcome to an algebra video tutorial. We're going to be learning about polynomial long division. So throughout this whole series, working with polynomials and polynomial operations, we've learned how to add, we've learned how to subtract, we've learned how to multiply, and we're just starting to get into division, and division tends to be the trickiest. So polynomial long division, we're going to go through this process. We're going to go through it really slowly. I'm going to try and indicate step by step what we're doing. And if you're comfortable at all remembering about long division from just numbers, you might see aspects of this that look familiar as we're doing the division problem here. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this thing. So we got going. We've got a 4-term polynomial, x to the third minus x squared minus 39x plus 54. And we're going to divide all this by a binomial, x minus 6. All right, so let's talk about how we're going to do this. We're going to set it up in long division. So I got to draw my long division bars here. The part that we're dividing goes on the inside. So I'm going to write it out in blue here. So x to the third minus x squared minus 39x plus 54. We call that our dividend. It is the part that's being divided. Now, what am I dividing it by? I'm dividing it by this x minus 6 binomial. So I'm going to write that in front. And in some ways, we're trying to see, taking this whole thing, I'm trying to see how many times does x minus 6 factor into this thing. And we're going to slowly work through that here. Okay, so here's the method that we're going to do. We look at the first terms, and then we slowly go through each of these two terms, and we're trying to slowly cancel things out as I subtract parts away. So let's focus on the first term here. We've got x to the third. What I need is some term on top that when I multiply it by the first term here, it's going to equal x to the third. Well, what times x makes x to the third? Well, I need to multiply it by x squared. Now let's distribute it. X squared times x is going to multiply to make x to the third. But I also have to multiply x squared times the negative 6. So I'm going to end up with negative 6x squared. All right, so we're just focused on the first two terms. We're seeing how many times this thing can fit into it. And since there's only two terms, we're focusing on the first two terms of our polynomial being divided by. So now we subtract things out. But since it's a subtraction, I'm going to distribute the subtraction. And now we divide things out. If I do it correctly, sorry, I subtract things out. If I do it correctly, I should always end up getting a 0 because these first two terms need to subtract out to make 0. That's how we progress through this thing. I picked x squared, multiplied by x to get x third because I know those will subtract to 0. All right, but I gotta subtract the other part. So I got negative x squared minus another negative number. If I distribute that negative, it ends up becoming negative x squared plus 6x squared, two negatives. So negative x squared plus 6x squared is going to give me positive 5x squared. And we've just done the first step. Now we go through again. Instead of focusing on this x to the third, we've taken care of this whole row or this whole column. Now I'm going to focus on 5x squared. What do I need to have here to multiply by x to turn it into 5x squared? Well, I'm going to have to multiply it by 5. And I already have an x, so I need to multiply by another x, and it's going to be a positive. Here we go. We do the same thing again now. 5x squared, I take all of this, multiplied by the x, gives me 5x squared. That's what I wanted. I want to have these two things be identical, so they subtract out to 0. But I got two terms, so the 5x also has to multiply the negative 6 to make negative 30x. 5 times negative 6 is negative 30, and I still have the x. And I forgot to do this, but I need to bring down, since I have two terms, I need to bring down the negative 39x. All right, now we got another subtraction problem. Let's subtract things out. 5x squared minus 5x squared gives me 0. I like that. That's what I want. But now I have negative 39x minus negative 30x. That ends up becoming negative 39x plus 30 with a double negative. So the result is those two things subtract out to make negative 9x. All right, we're kind of making our way through it, right? I've got one thing left here. I'm going to bring down the 54. There's my two terms I'm working with. Again, I can only work with two terms at a time because I'm dividing a binomial into this thing. But now let's look at, let's get a nice different color here. Let's go back to, let's get this one here. So now I've got to get negative 9x squared. So what do I multiply right here by to get a negative 9x squared? Well, I need to multiply x times negative 9. And negative 9 times x will give me that negative 9x. And that's what I want. Negative 9 times x gives me negative 9x. Those will now subtract out to 0. But I've got to take negative 9 multiplied by the negative 6 is going to give me plus 54. Let's subtract these two things out. Negative 9x minus negative 9x turns to 0. 54 minus 54 turns into 0. And what we see here is there's no remainder. There's nothing left. I've got it all the way down to 0, so it divided evenly. All right, so if I take this 4-term polynomial and we divide it by x minus 6, the result, the quotient, label that here, this is my quotient. It equals x squared plus 5x minus 6. So I ended up seeing when I divided them, I got a trinomial. And just for labeling's sake, this part was the divisor because we're dividing into things. And this whole part here is the dividend. Just kind of using some division, let me write that right, the dividend, not dividend. So there's some terminology in terms of dividing. Okay, so let's kind of take a second look. So we did my dividing, I did long division. Hopefully that made sense to you as we went through it. But here's a way to check that we did it correctly. So anything division, if this divided by this should equal x squared plus 5x minus 9, well then we should be able to check it by doing some multiplication. So let's do that over here. Does x minus 6, if I multiply it by x squared plus 5x minus 9, that should get us back to the dividend that we started with, that 4-term polynomial. So let's check it out. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute. X times x squared is going to give me x cubed. X times 5x is going to be plus 5x squared. X times negative 9 is going to be negative 9x. Now we move on to the next term. Negative 6 times x squared is negative 6x squared. Negative 6 times 5x is negative 30x. And negative 6 times negative 9 is plus 54. Now let's just double check like terms. X to the third, I don't have any x to the thirds, so I'm going to start off with that. 5x squared, and I have a negative 6x squared. Those are going to combine to make minus 1x squared. Negative 9 minus 30x. Those are like terms. Those are going to combine to make negative 39x. And finally, we got our plus 54. And look at that. We get right back to the dividend that we started with. So you can always check your work. If you're feeling shaky doing the division and you get something and you're just like, I don't know if that's right, come back over and do some multiplication. Take your divisor multiplied by your quotient, you should get right back to the dividend as a way to check that you did the division correctly. All right, hopefully that's a helpful example of polynomial long division and gives you something to work with and base with as you're doing your own practice.